I'm Jim Eachus. Thank you for coming out this evening. I'm going to tell you some stories. I think you'll enjoy the stories, but I'm also going to try to make you uncomfortable. I'll start by taking you back in time to December 1st, 1941. I don't think any of you go back that far. Some of you do, okay. All right. Well, I do exactly. The date is December 1st, 1941. Ruth has just found out she's pregnant. She thinks her husband, Joe, is the handsomest and smartest man in the world. And she's delighted to imagine that now they're going to be raising 2 children together. She would have been even more excited if she'd known it was me. In Europe, England and Germany are locked in a death struggle. The outcome will determine the fate of mankind for the next 100 years. But Americans don't want to get involved. It's a European problem. We don't want it to become our problem. Most Americans would rather see England win, but if you asked them to sacrifice, they'd say, we've just been through 10 years of depression. We don't have anything left to sacrifice. President FDR knows how important it is, but he can't move the American people. He's been able to get a little help through Congress by calling it Lend-Lease instead of aid, over the vocal opposition of such influential skeptics as Charles Lindbergh. FDR knows that there's a tipping point in the struggle for the survival of democracy. He knows that if Hitler succeeds in strangling England through the U-boat war in the North Atlantic, there'll be no way to stop fascism from conquering the world. The British fleet and the British industrial capacity will be at the service of the bad guys, and there'll be no platform in Western Europe for launching a counterattack. The Normandy fleet would have to cross the Atlantic Ocean, not just the English Channel. In Oklahoma, the old folks have noticed a change. Well, at least the weather's getting better. We don't have those terrible blizzards like we used to have when I was young. In England, an engineer named Guy Callender has presented data to the Royal Meteorological Society. He shows that the Earth's average temperature has increased slightly. He suggests that industrial carbon dioxide might be the cause. Well, now let's move ahead just a few days to December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, devastation to the American fleet. If you've known any Pearl Harbor survivors, like my old neighbor Bob French, you might have an idea of how traumatized they were. December 8, 1941, everything has changed. My father, Joe, was in the Naval Reserve and was called up almost immediately. He and Ruth sat down and looked at Ruth's options. They decided that she would close their apartment in Indiana and move her little family to her parents' farm in New York. Joe and Ruth put their dreams of happy family life on hold and said a tearful goodbye. Now Americans understood that it was their war, and they went to work on it. December 1st, 1941 is just like where we're at with climate change. Most Americans know there's a problem, but they want it to be somebody else's problem. The Chinese burn a lot of coal. Let them change their ways. We've just been through a long recession. We don't feel like sacrificing. So what if the Earth's temperature has risen by 1 degree? What's the big deal? Ocean levels are rising by 3 millimeters a year? Let our great-grandchildren worry about that. Bad things will happen by the end of the century. I'll be dead then. Why should I care? Species are going extinct. Well, that is too bad, but it takes all my effort just to make sure I don't go extinct. Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. Hurricane Sandy shut down New York City. If those weren't a Pearl Harbor for climate change, then climate change isn't going to give us a Pearl Harbor, at least not until it's too late. Each weather event is just an event. No single event proves anything about climate change. Scientists can't attribute any specific event to climate change. Might be just a random fluctuation. Skeptics make the most of this uncertainty. You can disagree with them, but you can't point to dramatic proof. Only statistics identify climate change, and whoever got excited about statistics? I've alluded to the history of climate change, the pre-war hints that something was happening. I think it's worthwhile to know that it goes a lot further back than that. In 1822, a French physicist made the first attempt to calculate the Earth's energy budget, the amount of heat the Earth receives from the sun versus the amount it radiates back into space. The result of his calculation was that the Earth should be a frozen ice ball. He speculated about several possible explanations for the discrepancy, including the idea that maybe somehow the air acted as a blanket, holding in some of the heat. His name was Joseph Fourier, and engineers know him better as a mathematician, the inventor of the Fourier series. Do any of you know somebody who has odd ideas about health? Yeah, okay. Fourier's life would be a cautionary tale for them. Fourier's odd idea was that you could stay healthy by keeping the body wrapped in blankets whenever possible. He died in his home at the age of 62 when he tripped on his blanket and fell down the stairs. It's okay to laugh. The humor is a little dark. In the middle of the 19th century, an English scientist, John Tyndall, discovered that carbon dioxide is opaque to infrared radiation. In other words, it absorbs heat rather than passing it through. The answer to Fourier's puzzle. In 1896, a Swedish scientist, Svante Arrhenius, suggested that industrial carbon dioxide might increase the Earth's temperature. He asked his colleague, Arvid Hugboom, who'd been studying natural processes involving carbon dioxide. Hugboom calculated the rate that the industrial activity of the day was putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. He was startled to find that it was on the same scale as the natural exchange of carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the earth and ocean. That was 1896. Swedes turn up a lot in this story, and I'll tell you why. In the 19th century, the ice ages have been discovered. And the big question was, what caused them, and might they come again? If you live in a northern country like Sweden, with your capital at the latitude of Anchorage, Alaska, you know that when the ice ages return, you'll be the first to see it. Climatology wasn't a big, important science in those days, but for those who were interested in it, cooling remained the focus until well into the 20th century. It wasn't until the 1970s that warming began to contend seriously with cooling for scientific interest. But summers in the 1980s broke records of heat and drought. And finally, in 1990, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its first report. And they announced, with much cautious wording, that there was scientific consensus on global warming. That warning was over 20 years ago, and almost nothing has been done to address it. When the war started, Joe was teaching mathematics at Purdue University, where he had a reputation for throwing chalk at students who fell asleep in his class. Being a mathematician, he was interested in cryptanalysis, code breaking. As a reservist, he had taken the Navy's correspondence course in it, so when he was called up, he was sent to Washington, D.C., and assigned to the Navy's code breaking department. He found himself in a large room where one man was learning Morse code by tapping out messages to himself. Another man was learning Japanese by talking to himself. And a third man was trying to call himself on the phone by way of Alaska. Joe said, "I'm going to like it here." The U.S. Navy had put most of its code-breaking effort into the Japanese naval code successfully. Thanks to the friendship between FDR and Churchill, the United States and Britain had negotiated an information sharing agreement on code breaking. Joe was available at the right moment with the right skill set, got the assignment of being the U.S. Navy's liaison to Bletchley Park, the project north of London where the British had broken the German Enigma code. The British accepted him there under the agreement, but Bletchley Park was their most cherished secret. So they were naturally suspicious and reluctant to share any more information about it than they had to. Nominally, Joe was there to work alongside the British, but his real assignment was to bring back to Washington everything he could find out about everything that was going on at Bletchley Park. When Joe had something to report, he had to travel back to Washington. I know he came home sometime during the war because I have a picture that Ruth took of Joe in his Navy uniform with 2 toddlers. In fact, his first trip back was in September 1942, just a few weeks after I was born. He was carrying the complete plans of the machine the British had built to decode German messages. Portugal was neutral, so transatlantic travel went through Lisbon. Joe's description of Lisbon was that it was full of men in black topcoats. The topcoat hid your uniform so nobody could see whether you were British or German or American. Joe would have fit right in. He was a tall, slim man with a black topcoat and a cigarette. The transatlantic flight was in a Pan Am Clipper, a beautiful flying boat designed and built by Boeing as the first successful commercial transatlantic aircraft. Fascinating airplane. It had four 1,500 horsepower piston engines, wingspan 3/4 of a 747, and there were catwalks inside the wings. If an engine failed, an engineer would shut it down, go out into the wing, and repair it in flight. Ken Follett has written a spy novel about a trip in a Pan Am Clipper. It's called Night Over Water. Now I want to draw a map of the Atlantic Ocean in your mind's eye. If you cheat by looking at the map on the wall over there, you'll get caught because you'll be thoroughly confused. Start with a big plain blue blob. That part's easy enough. And now let's put some land around your ocean. On your upper right, you have Europe with Spain and Portugal, separated by the Mediterranean from Africa and West Africa. On your upper left, you have North America with Florida, separated by the Caribbean from South America and Brazil. If you're putting labels on your map, remember the Mediterranean has 2 R's and Caribbean has 2 B's. Now I want you to draw 3 horizontal lines across your map: upper, middle, lower. These are the 3 transatlantic air routes of the day. The northern route connected Ireland with Newfoundland, an approximation of Charles Lindbergh's pioneering flight, which is only 15 years earlier. During the war, that was a combat zone, no passenger traffic. It was only used to shuttle fighters and bombers from American factories to British airfields. Not all of them made it. There's still an entire squadron of P-38s on Greenland. They're buried now under 250 feet of ice and snow, except one of them that was excavated a few years ago and restored to flying condition. The middle route was the one Joe used, from Lisbon to the Azores to Bermuda and up to New York. A southern route connected West Africa with Brazil. Do any of you listen to the news on NPR? Yeah? Okay. You've heard their Africa correspondent say, "This is Fabia Kostakin reporting from Dakar." Did you ever look up Dakar to see where it is? If you think of West Africa bulging into the Atlantic Ocean as the breast of a well-endowed woman, Dakar is its nipple, a few degrees above the equator. On the other side, at the tip of the point that Brazil makes into the Atlantic, is Natal, a few degrees below the equator. The longest leg of the Clipper flight was from Dakar to Natal, 11 hours at 183 miles an hour. Now that you've got this map in your mind, I want to talk about hurricanes. Hurricanes form off the coast of Dakar. They travel west into the Caribbean, or west and then north to North America. In 1998, Hurricane Mitch went into the Caribbean and dropped 6 feet of rain on Honduras. It killed over 11,000 people, washed away most of the roads and bridges in Honduras and Nicaragua, and set their economic development back by 20 years. Funny thing happened in 2004. For the first time ever recorded, a hurricane formed in the South Atlantic and went southwest. Made landfall at Torres, Brazil, halfway down the coast between Natal and the tip of South America. Another unique thing happened in 2005. A hurricane formed off Dakar, made a U-turn, and came ashore in Spain. Boy, were they surprised. 2005 was an interesting year in other ways. There were 4 Category 5 hurricanes. There'd never been more than 2 in one season before. And of the 6 most powerful hurricanes ever, 3 were in 2005, including Hurricane Katrina. Now I want you to follow your map north to where Greenland drops into the top of the Atlantic like a cork in the top of a bottle. Hi, Cliff. When you think about rising sea levels, don't think about millimeters per year. Think about the Greenland ice sheet. It's almost 2 miles thick, and it holds enough water to raise the sea level worldwide by 23 feet. Or the West Antarctic ice sheet, which holds enough water to raise the sea level by another 16 feet. And those are the small ones. Nobody can predict when these ice sheets are going to melt, but they are accelerating their flows in unexpected ways. Manhattan is an island in the North Atlantic, and not a very high one. We learned last fall what a storm surge can do to Manhattan. Manhattan will last longer than Tuvalu or the Maldives, but not for the duration of a 99-year lease. Well, continue north, off the top of your map, to the Arctic Ocean, the top of the globe. The amount of Arctic ice varies seasonally. The amount of winter ice has been declining steadily as long as people have been keeping records of it. In 2007, the summer ice declined so drastically that people were predicting an ice-free Arctic by the summer of 2015. It recovered somewhat in the next few years, but then it went into decline again, and last summer it was well below the 2007 level. The Northwest Passage, for centuries impassable to explorers, now it's been traversed by a scheduled cruise liner and a solo sailor. Stop thinking about the end of the century. Really bad things are going to happen while I'm still around to say, I told you so. A newspaper article summarized climate change by saying, get used to hurricanes, floods, and drought. This is the new normal. Well, they almost got it right, except the new normal is there is no normal. Things are going to keep getting worse. The storm's bigger, the flood's deeper, the drought's longer, until we do something about it. In 2011, the United States experienced 14 weather disasters costing $1 billion or more each. They broke the old record of 9 in 1 year. Thinking about cutting FEMA's budget? Forget it. The glacier on top of Mount Kilimanjaro covers a quarter of the area that it had a century ago. Glacier National Park in Montana used to have 150 glaciers. Now it has 25. You want to see them? You better get on your horse and get over there. Sugar was rationed in wartime Britain, and the British were desperate for sugar for their tea. Joe found a way to take advantage of the situation. Since he was stationed alone at Bletchley Park, he had a peculiar status in the Navy. In Navy parlance, he was a detached unit, the bureaucratic equivalent of a ship. As such, he could go to the US Navy warehouse in London and draw supplies. So he went to London and he drew a 100-pound bag of sugar. When word got around Bletchley Park that Joe has sugar, almost everybody found some excuse to drop by his desk and chat. His handlers in Washington told him to get an organization chart at Bletchley Park. He tried the direct approach on this one. He went to the project director, Edward Travis, and asked for an organization chart. "We don't have one," was the reply. Joe said he didn't know whether Travis meant we don't have a chart or we don't have an organization. Before the war, there was a young Irish woman who worked for the British Foreign Office. Since she was fluent in several European languages, they thought she might be useful at Bletchley Park, and she was assigned there. But in 1940, it was still hard for men to give real responsibility to a woman, no matter how talented. So she was made typist to the project director, and later his personal assistant. She'd never seen Americans before except in movies, so when they started showing up at Bletchley Park, she was fascinated. Joe met her and recognized her potential. Confronted with a bright and attractive young woman who had access to all the secrets he was there to gather, he did what any good spy would have done. He seduced her. I take issue in a small way with the phrase, the greatest generation, just because it's in the singular. There were multiple generations involved in winning the war. My grandparents owned and operated a dairy farm, full-time work for both of them, and for Ruth and anybody else who happened to be on the farm, except me, of course. When the war started, my grandfather was already retirement age, but he took a job in a munitions factory a dozen miles from the farm. He got up before dawn, milked the cows, drove to the factory, put in a shift, drove home again, and finished the farm work. My grandmother, of course, put in similar hours on the farm. During the Depression, many American families had small vegetable gardens that they used to extend their meager budgets. These morphed easily into victory gardens. Everybody who owned a little dirt grew vegetables to support the war effort. At its peak, the Victory Garden movement produced 40% of America's vegetables. Now that didn't win the war, but it did make a difference. Your hybrid cars and your home conservation efforts are the victory gardens of climate change. By themselves, they won't solve the problem, but they are an important part of the solution. After the war, my father didn't like to talk about his wartime activities. It wasn't PTSD, he never saw combat. It was the secrecy that was so vital to the success of Bletchley Park. That was why Winston Churchill called the codebreakers, "The geese laid the golden eggs and never cackled." If you tried to ask Joe about it, he would divert the conversation with an amusing anecdote. For example, an American soldier was arrested running naked down the hallway of a London hotel. The charge was being out of uniform. His defense was that he was suitably attired for the sport in which he was engaged. The British really didn't like having American troops stationed there. They used to say, there are only three things wrong with the Yanks. They're overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Those were the days when ladies wore girdles. A British manufacturer made a girdle with an instruction label that said, "May be removed by a strong yank." Yanks were so unpopular that he changed the label. Now it read, "May be removed by a strong jerk." Those are old jokes. Let me tell you a new joke. Funny thing happened on the way to the Kremlin. Moscow. It's at the latitude of Ketchikan, Alaska. Muscovites are used to cold. They're not used to heat. In 2010, Moscow set an all-time high temperature record on July 23rd, but that record was broken on July 24th. And that record, in turn, was broken on July 25th. And Moscow continued to set new temperature records on July 26, July 27, July 28, and July 29. Wildfires raged around the city. Peat bogs that had been drained for fuel burned. The air in Moscow was full of smoke and fumes until mid-August. The official Russian position had been that climate change is a fraud. But when President Medvedev announced a state of emergency, he said, "What's happening to our planet's climate right now needs to be a wake-up call for all of us." Remember the old folks in Oklahoma? The summer before last, they had 30 days in a row of temperatures over 100 degrees. But that's nothing compared with Wichita Falls, Texas, where they had 100 days over 100 degrees. And last summer, the heat moved to the U.S. East Coast, including Washington, D.C. If that didn't change the minds of some skeptics in Congress, maybe Hurricane Sandy will. Do you know what a tipping point is? How many thought it was the percentage of the check that you need to leave as a tip? No? Okay, good. A tipping point is the point where a process becomes self-sustaining and no longer needs an outside force to drive it. Suppose, for example, your car breaks down and you need to push it over a hill to get to the repair shop. You get some friends together, you push it up the hill. When you get over the top, you don't need to push anymore. That's a tipping point. In fact, you might want to jump in and slam on the brakes, but you can't. It's already rolling away faster than you can run. The Earth's climate involves a number of processes that have a potential like that to keep themselves going even after we stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. One example is the Arctic Ocean. Snow and ice are white and reflect solar heat back into space. Open water is dark and absorbs solar heat. So the warmer it gets, the faster it warms. That's what engineers call positive feedback. Another example is permafrost. Melting permafrost has been a problem in Russia and Alaska for years. I used to travel regularly to Alaska, and it was reports of melting permafrost that first began to make me conscious of climate change. The problem isn't just buildings falling down, or Alaska natives who can't drive their off-road vehicles from one village to another. There's methane under the permafrost that's released when it melts. And methane is a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. There are huge deposits of methane under the oceans, trapped there by cold and pressure. Methane is a fossil fuel, just like coal and oil. The only difference is methane doesn't need an industrial process to release it. All it needs is warmth. Russian researchers have already seen methane bubbling out of the Arctic Ocean off their north coast. Machiavelli understood tipping points. He wrote during the Renaissance, "By seeing problems at a distance, the evils that may arise from them are soon cured. But when, through want of foresight, they are suffered to increase to such a height that they are perceptible to everyone, there is no longer any remedy. when, through want of foresight, they are suffered to increase to such a height that they are perceptible to everyone, there is no longer any remedy. When the Greenland ice sheet is melted and the ocean level has risen by 23 feet, it'll be way too late. The greatest generation fought and won the Second World War, but they needed Pearl Harbor to awaken them to action. If today's generation overcomes climate change, they'll be even greater because they did it without a Pearl Harbor. But if they fail, they'll be the generation that squandered mankind's last chance. When I was a teenager in the 1950s, nuclear annihilation was the big threat. T.S. Eliot's poem was popular. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. In 2007, the IPCC released another report. They considered a range of scenarios from best case to worst case. Things are already worse than their worst case scenario in the rate we're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and the loss of polar ice. Before the war, the Japanese naval commander, Admiral Yamamoto, had studied in the United States and then traveled here as a diplomat. He warned his government, don't get into a war with America. Their industrial potential will swamp us. They ignored his warning. In 1940, Detroit produced 4 million automobiles. FDR ordered that entire industry converted to making tanks, planes, and weapons. By the end of 1942, America was producing 0 cars, but almost 4,000 tanks a month, 5 times the best rate Hitler could hope to achieve. That's how we won the war. We swamped them. And that's what we need to do with climate change. We should be making solar panels, wind turbines, geothermal installations, tidal generators, everything we know how to make, just as fast as we can make it. A 30% reduction by 2030 isn't nearly good enough. We need to be shutting down the coal and oil plants just as fast as we can replace them. But that is where the parallel ends. We need to make an all-out effort on the scale of the Second World War, but we don't need to send our young people overseas to die in battle. Did you ever have a nightmare where something awful was happening and you tried to scream but no sound came out? That's what climate scientists are experiencing today. Part of the problem is that scientists aren't very good at screaming. In 2005, the National Academy of Sciences issued a statement. They said, climate change is real, it is human-caused, it's dire, and it's urgent that something be done about it. How many of you have read that statement? Good, very good. How many knew it exists? A few more, I hope. When you read a news report of an extreme weather event, watch for the words climate change. You'll rarely find them. You need to supply that part yourself. NASA's top climate scientist, James Hansen, has written a book called Storms of My Grandchildren. It's a curious mixture of concrete science with screams of frustration over the political resistance to doing anything about it. Well, I've told you several stories, and it's time to start wrapping them up. As you know, America, England, and Russia won the war, defeated the Axis powers. FDR died of a stroke in April 1945 when victory was in sight but not yet achieved. Admiral Yamamoto was killed in an American air raid, made possible when a decoded Japanese message revealed his travel plans. Those who survived the war mourned their losses but were otherwise satisfied with the outcome. In time, even Germany and Japan were happy. And the transformation of American society, brought about by the war effort, launched several decades of American prosperity. In 1945, the United Nations was formed in the hopes that, at least in some cases, talk could take the place of combat. Ruth had prayed every day for Joe's safe return, and he did return safely, but the casualties of war take many forms. By the end of the war, Joe had fallen in love with the Irish girl at Bletchley Park. Ruth was crushed, but she recovered. She took a job at the university and raised her two boys as a single mom. She was the greatest of the greatest generation. Climate change? Well, the oil interests managed to stave off action until several important climate processes were beyond control. The Greenland ice sheet melted, the West Antarctica ice sheet melted, East Antarctica, the biggest ice sheet of all, began to melt. In Manhattan and the coastal cities, only the higher buildings are visible above the waves. Human society collapsed. The biggest impact on humans was food supplies. Food became so scarce that only those with a lot of money could get it. And then even scarcer until only those with a lot of guns could get it. Drought made dust bowls of corn and wheat farms. Without glacial meltwater for irrigation, the rice-growing areas of Asia dried up. The tiny creatures that are at the base of the ocean food chain died. From Alaska to Bangladesh, no more ocean fisheries. Some people cried out, "Why did God let this happen?" Others cried out, "Why did our parents and grandparents let this happen?" Around the globe, billions of people did what people do when their homeland can't feed them. They packed up their wives and the babies and their guns and they started walking. Mexico became a desert. 100 million Mexicans swarmed across the border into California and Texas. Finding no food there, they kept walking. Many species went extinct. Only the most adaptable survived: rats, crows, and humans, and tropical diseases. Now, this part's really important, and I want to make sure I get it right, so I'm going to check my crystal ball. No, that's not what happened. The people rose up. They overthrew the oil interests. They demanded an end to government by lobbyists. Technocrats replaced plutocrats. People who actually wanted to solve the problems began making the plans. They recognized the central importance of sustainability. They recognized that now it could only be achieved by the global community, but they also saw the logical contradiction in using force to get cooperation on sustainability. So America decided to lead by example. Americans stopped saying, "We'll only do it if they do it," and did it. The rest of the world, seeing that sustainability could be done, seeing that it was good, and seeing how to do it, soon followed. In time, even Saudi Arabia was happy. And now, my message to you is, make it so. Thank you.